Good morning. I'm so glad to see each and every one of you who made the choice to be with us this morning. Your presence here indeed was a choice. And it's to be commended because it says that you care about those things that are spiritual in nature and eternal in their value. And you are here to follow the will of the Lord on the first day of the week and come together and worship. And as part of that worship, I'm honored to be able to lead us in a message from God's Word. And I'll be excited to do that in just a moment. But let me mention a couple of things in terms of housekeeping, so to speak. First of all, if you happen to have children between the ages of 2 and 5, we have a children's Bible hour that they can go to and participate in a lesson geared towards their age group. And so we encourage you to dismiss them at this time out, and they'll be directed to a classroom on the left. And also wanted to mention, if you happen to be visiting with us and you haven't done so yet, will you take one of the yellow visitor cards and fill out some of your basic information? Not that we're going to solicit you, but that we may be able to thank you for your visit and also give you an opportunity. If you had some sort of request or need, you can indicate that there. We would appreciate that. I was a little worried because I wanted to make a point from this particular song that was just led. I was a bit worried that you might not know the song. And so I wasn't going to request it. But then I found out Ron was leading singing, and I thought, I'll just give it to Ron, and if he doesn't mention it, then it may just fall that people thought, well, he just led one that we don't know. But he mentioned my name, so I did pick that one. I did have some concern that we might not know it, but I think enough of us knew it. But I just love the message of this song. And we read from our reading this morning that, well, we are to teach and admonish one another in spiritual songs. And so what is it that we can learn from this particular song? This particular song, as we just sang, and you're familiar with enough to at least hum along with it and read the words on the screen, we're going to look at this idea or this notion of none of self and all of thee. Now, if you were following along with the song, or if you're familiar with the song, you'll note that there are 4 distinct categories of individuals. And that's why I thought this would be a neat idea for take those 4 categories, make them into 4 points, and then we've got a sermon. But more important than that, we have a very needful message. But you know, as I started this lesson this week, I thought this is going to be an easy one. And the more I spent time with it, the more I thought, well, if I'm not careful, it will be more difficult than it has to be, and it'll be misunderstood, and it'll leave everybody leaving here feeling guilty. And that's not my intention. And so hopefully we'll work through that as we make some definitions of these particular categories that we can draw from this song. The first one that we have is, it starts off progressively and stating in the song, well, I was proud to say to Jesus, hey man, it's all of self and none of thee. And so that's one of the categories of individual. Now hopefully nobody in the audience fits into that category this morning, but there's plenty of folks that do. For example, as we think about this, and I'm going to throw up here a percentage. I'm not real good at math, but I can figure out none is 0 and all is 100%. So if we had a pie graph up here, and it was one of them ones that's colored, it would be colored one color, and it'd be 100%, and it all of self, not even a sliver of anything else. And that's all of self and none of thee. The unbeliever would fall into this category. Do you remember in 2 Timothy, Paul's writing to Timothy, and one of the things that he is writing about is how in the latter times or in the future times, there will be, these type individuals, and they're described in some unflattering terms. For example, they'll be unthankful and disobedient to parents and a few other things, but one of the things that's mentioned of them is that they will, be lovers of self rather than lovers of God. And that they'll be selfish. I don't know how much dealings you have with people in the world, but I think this categorizes most folks. They're all about themselves, and they're none about the Lord or anything spiritual. They don't care anything about attending any service at any church. They don't care about reading their Bible. They don't care about spiritual things. They just care about their own interests, pursuits, hobbies, their career, whatever it might be. That's the unbeliever. We also see that this is equated to what we might call the natural man or the carnal man. We're given that description of those 2 types of individual in comparison to the spiritual man, incidentally. And the carnal man or the natural man is not able to discern the things that are spiritual. In fact, he really finds no use for them. In fact, the text says he refers to them as foolishness. You know, there's people out in the world that what we're doing and gathering here to do this day is foolishness to them. Well, and their whole life is about their own self, right? It's all the self and none of thee. I don't want any of that. No, thank you. I'm not interested in that. The carnal man does not receive the things of God. And the idea of this, we see also in the book of Galatians, where it says the flesh. You know, there's this great comparison over and over again in Scripture between the fleshly nature we have and the spiritual nature. And that we follow or are led by or guided by one or the other. Either our flesh, which is like, hey, I want to go to this, I want to have that pleasure, I want to enjoy this. The whole hedonistic framework that really defines our society. And then there's the spiritual, that wants to be led by the Spirit through the Word of God and be directed into the will of God. And there's this battle that goes on between the two. And in Galatians chapter 5, it says the flesh, it's about selfish ambitions. What do I want? What will I enjoy? What do I want to do with my time? What do I want to do with myself? I just want to be like a mere man and do things of men and, you know, just kind of, well, just follow after what feels good. And then there are those who are referred to in Romans chapter 1 as having their heart darkened. And it describes them as having a knowledge of God, but they've kind of suppressed it intentionally, and they choose rather to, well, just have their futility of mind and the darkness of their heart. In other words, I just want to entertain myself. I just want to go after what I want. It's all about me, and it's none about thee. We also see this idea of being lovers of the world. Now, here's where we have to define some stuff for the first time, and then we'll have to define it a lot in the end. You know, because in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, it says we're not to love the world or the things of the world. And as you recall, and I paraphrase a tad, if we do that, the love of the Father is not in us. Well, what's the idea there? Well, if we define what it means to love the world, it means you love and are loyal and devoted to the world in such a sense that you have ostracized yourself from God. James described it like this. You have become a friend with the world and made yourself an enemy of God. And the idea is that there's no room for God in your heart because all it's filled with is love for the world. You know, the things I can see, taste, touch, feel, experience, that I'm all about that and I'm none about spiritual stuff. Now that defines a whole group of people. Hopefully not anybody in the room, but certainly plenty of folks we know. So that's the first of these four. All of self, it's all about me and none about thee. The next, as we go somewhat progressively in this song that's to teach and admonish, there's this idea of some of self and some of thee. Now, I've called this 50-50. Now, again, these are not inspired percentages. I'm just kind of trying to illustrate these four categories. The first one's easy. It's just 100 and 0. This one is some and some. I just do 50-50. If there's a pie graph, you know, we'd think half of it was blue, if you will, and half of it was red. Kind of like we divide the country. I'm just kidding. All right. That's as political as I'll get. All right, so 50% of self and 50% of the Lord. All right, so I call this kind of like being religious, but then pursuing self-interest. Kind of like you're vacillating between the two, kind of like you're on the fence. Y'all remember the rich young ruler? I know you do. Remember the rich young ruler? Question. Was he religious? Well, he came to the Lord and basically said, what do I need to do to go to heaven? And the Lord said, we need to keep the commandments. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing as you know, which ones? And Jesus named a few. And then he said, well, I've done all those since I was a boy. What's that mean? He was religious. He was religious. But do you remember when Jesus said, well, there's one thing you lack. One thing that's getting in your way of being what you ought to be and doing what you ought to do, and it's your stuff. Because you love your stuff, you're loyal to your stuff, you're devoted to your stuff. You have this allegiance to your stuff. Your stuff has become your master. And you can't serve two masters. So you're going to need to get rid of the stuff, but don't worry. You'll have treasures in heaven. You can follow me and you won't have to worry about anything. Everything's going to be good. And he said, nah, I'd rather just go back to my stuff. Do you think he quit his religious observances? I doubt it. The idea was he was religious, that was part, but another part of him was pursuing his self-interest and was motivated and loyal to and devoted to his self-interest. In Philippians chapter 1, do you know it says that you can even be a gospel preacher and do it in pretense, verse 16 of chapter 1? And in verse 15 of chapter 1, it talks about how people are preaching the gospel out of selfish ambition. That's why they're doing it. Now, Paul went on to make a very interesting and good point. He said, hey, at least Christ's getting preached in the process. But nonetheless, there are those who have some religion, half, if you will. And then the other half is just pursuing their self-interest or self-motivated. On one occasion, Paul said some people think godliness is a means of gain. Well, that's ill-motivated, so they've got, some religion, some devotion, but some self-interest. The other we might call is having some religion, but no self-control. Now, if you have your Bible, will you follow along in these familiar verses and read them for yourself? Let's look at James 1. Look at verse 26 and verse 27 there. The idea is, I got some religion, and I use religion in the sense that we find it here, loyalty, devotion. And the idea is, I got some religion. I come to the church service on Sunday morning. That's some religion. Okay, yeah, that's some. That's some. That's some of thee. But we also see that that's some of self. Look at James chapter 1. Look at verse 26 and 27 there. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, that one's religion is useless. And he goes on to say, pure and undefiled religion before God includes some things, some actions, some things that you're going to do. And he mentions a couple: visit orphans and widows, and then keep yourself unspotted from the world. Now in James 2, he gives us another scenario. He says, you want me to tell you what dead faith looks like? Dead faith looks like, I know your plight and your condition, but I'm not going to do anything to help you. Now, the living faith can actually be not only exercised, but demonstrated and seen. In other words, he says, I will show you my faith by my works. And the idea is, you can have some religion, but then some, let's just say, lack of self-control. Or you have your religion, but you go out and indulge yourself in things that are knowingly wrong. Or you leave things undone, where James also said, him who knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. This sum of self and some of thee is kind of like, I got religion, but I also got some self-righteousness. And I think about the Pharisee. Well, this particular Pharisee in this parable that Jesus told of the Pharisee and tax collector that went up to pray. Y'all remember that. It's in Luke 18. And the idea is, this Pharisee, he had a lot of religion, didn't he? In fact, he had a religious resume he wanted to recite in a prayer to God. And he said, I fast twice a week and I tithe on all the things I possess, and I'm a good religious fella. And we might say in our common day, I go to the church services, I give my money on the collection, I read my Bible, I try not to do this and I try not to do that, and I got a pretty good resume here. But as you recall, the one that went home justified was the one who didn't quote his spiritual resume. He wasn't filled with his own self-righteous and righteous pursuit in the eyes of God by his works. But he said, I'm a sinner in need of, your mercy. See, we can have some religion, devotion, loyalty, understanding, but we can also have some other things that, don't mix with that. We can have religion and no love. I think about Jonah. Y'all remember Jonah? Was Jonah religious? Man, he was a prophet. He was one of God's prophets. In fact, he was given a great big assignment, which he tried to, not submit to. He tried to circumvent the process, catch a ship all the way to the other side of the world, so to speak. And in the process, God intervened, and God sent him back on track and gave him a second chance. But his religion it stopped at a certain point. You remember how Jesus talked about love, and he said, hey, if you love your own, so what? Everybody does that. But you're supposed to love beyond your own. In fact, you're supposed to go beyond the love of your family and friends, people that treat you well, and have that love extend all the way to those who you're in an adversarial relationship, the one who might use you and despitefully use you and abuse you and, be your enemy. That pretty much summed up the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh. They were enemies. He had some religion, but no love. Some of thee, but some of self. See, myself, Jonah, I don't want to love those people. They're my enemies. Do you remember how Jesus said in John 13, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, and by this the world will know that you are my disciples. So it wasn't enough to have religious observances and go to the right place at the right time and read the right book when you're at home, or did it require not only that you have that, but then you actually have some fruit thereof. The fruit of the Spirit, incidentally, which includes love. All right, so there's some of self and some of thee. After keeping up, this should be number 3, and we're rocking right through this list. Let's look at the next in what might be called a progressive category in this song. None of self And all of these where we're trying to work ourselves to. But the next stage is less of self and more of thee. Remember last time we said if it was a percentage, some and some, it'd be 50-50, right? Well, I came up with 40-60. That could be 30-70. But the idea is if we're looking at a pie graph, and last time it was just blue and red, now it'd be like blue and red, but whichever one that you want to call the Lord, and I'd say I messed up because now I can't make one color that because I made a political statement, but I didn't mean to. But one of the colors, let's say that, would be like 60-40 or 70-30. That's where you've moved from some and some to less of self and more of thee. That might look like when we put our mind oriented properly, where we set our mind properly. In Colossians chapter 3, and then in chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, but in verse 2, it reminds us that we ought to set our mind on things that are above, not things that are on the earth. The idea is that we're progressing from being merely ritualistic or, quote, religious to moving beyond and detracting from self. Remember what John the Baptist said? I must decrease and you must increase. Was that 50-50? Well, no, it's at least 60-40. Hopefully it's 70-30, maybe 80-20. Right? Y'all with me? All right. So when we set and orient our mind properly, we're going beyond just merely religious observances. This is permeating more than just Sunday mornings. Y'all with me? And so Matthew chapter 16, do y'all remember when Peter tried to rebuke the Lord? I mean, after he had just professed his understanding and appreciation for who Jesus was, he then turned around after he learned the plan of Jesus ultimately going to the cross as an atonement, and he rebuked him. And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." And then he went on to say, "For you are mindful not of the things of God, but of the things of men." Now, the idea of progressing to less of self and decreasing self and increasing the Lord is that we have our mind, geared towards or oriented towards those things that are spiritual, not those things that are earthly. Also, we might say we are having less of self and more of thee when we're trying, when we're making that effort. This is going to sound like the most silly thing, maybe not the most silly thing I've said, but it's going to sound silly to say it, but I'm glad the things are in the Bible that are in the Bible. Duh. But the idea is, I'm really glad that it shows us the struggles, shortcomings, and even the falling of key individuals. I'm glad John Mark got homesick, left, and then came back. How he was not useful, then later useful. I'm glad for every episode in the life of Peter, because I can be like, I can relate to that. I'm thankful that Paul was so transparent in Romans chapter 7 that you go away with it like, yeah, thanks, Paul. Me too. And if you remember from this section, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but in Romans chapter 7, he's talking about this struggle between this same dichotomy, right? The spiritual and then the fleshly. And he says, man, and I'm paraphrasing, the things I don't want to do, those are things I end up doing. And the things I want to do, I don't do them. And he uses the term evil and good on one occasion because he repeats the statement twice in this section in Romans 7. He says, I want to do right, but man, then I find this war that's going on in me, and I don't. And then I don't want to do this thing that's wrong or evil, and then I find myself doing it. Man. And then he says, oh, what a wretched man. You ever felt like that? Maybe you speak inappropriately to yourself in your internal dialogue, and you say things like, oh, I'm such a failure, or oh, I'm such an idiot, or oh, I did it again. I mean, the idea is that Paul is being so transparent, he's saying, I'm giving myself a fit trying to do right, and I can't do it perfectly. I keep falling short. I keep missing the mark. But he would also say, I press on. I'm forgetting those things that are behind me, and I'm pressing on, and I'm going towards that goal line. I may trip, I may fall, but a righteous man get up 7 times and keep going to the end. I'm like that runner who's not just beating at the air, the boxer, and I'm like the runner who's not just going to run the race for a little while, but I'm going to finish this race. How do you know it's less of self and more of thee? When you're getting after it, when you're trying, when you're struggling, when you've got your mind properly oriented, when you're growing. Now, just showing up where you're supposed to show up, when you're supposed to show up on Sunday morning is not growth. It just did. I mean, it's admirable. It's where you ought to be. I'm not discrediting it. But It's more of that some of self and some of thee than it is less of self and more of thee. The brethren at Thessalonica in 2 Thessalonians, and I just love this statement in chapter 1 and verse 3. It says, their faith grows exceedingly. I just love that. I don't know why. But is that what can be said of us? Is your faith pretty much what it was this time last year, or this time 5 years ago, or this time 10 years ago? Or is it growing and advancing? Is it maturing? If your faith were a tree, would it be a sapling? Or would it be a tall oak tree? Is it growing? The next thing that we could offer is some type of evidence that what's in our life, it's less of self and more of thee, is can we see the big picture? On one occasion in Philippians chapter 1 in verse 12, Paul said that the things that have happened to me, and we might pause there and we could probably have a whole sermon, but the things that have happened to me, in part, he's talking about the fact that he's imprisoned at the moment. He's gone through a recent shipwreck and a whole host of other perils, and he lists some of those perils in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He went through this, that, and the other. Man, life wasn't easy. No prosperity gospel in the life of Paul. It was tough. And here he was looking at his current situation, which most of us would be whining and crying and grumbling, self included. I mean, I've been serving you, and here I am in prison. I mean, so we would all sit there and wallow in self-pity for the circumstance we found ourselves in, or at least most of us. Or maybe I'm just talking about me. But he said in his big picture scope, these things that have happened to me have actually turned out to the furtherance of the gospel. More folks are getting saved because I'm suffering. Good thing. Now, if we can move to the big picture, and we can suffer, and we can have setbacks, and we can have trials, and we can lose people we love, and have sicknesses and struggles, and all of these things that we can sit around and say, why me, or this isn't fair. If we can actually see the big picture, if we can lose someone we love who's a faithful Christian and have the right perspective in a funeral, that's less of self and more of thee. There's a few categories within that category. Let's look at the last one. This is the one where we all kind of get hung up, and where I had the concerns. When I was working on this lesson, I thought, I don't want to just merely present this and everybody go home and say, well, that ain't me. I don't think that. Because I think as we think about this, what we're doing, and this is maybe intimidating to say, 0% of self and 100% of the Lord. You might say, well, I can't do that. Yes, you can. Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37 says, you better. In fact, that's the greatest command, and the law and the prophets hinge on this. What? That you love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. Now, here's where we need to stop and pause and define a few things. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your strength, and your mind. Can we do that? I don't see a head shaking one. Let me try again. Can we do that? Yes. How do I know? Well, it's the summary of all of the books of the Old Testament that's driving us to this conclusion that we ought to love God with all we got. Can you do that? Sure we can. Now let me define it. That doesn't mean you can't love your mama or your spouse. You know, we talked about this idea of loving the world. Because if you love the world, there's zero love of the Father in you. Does that mean I can't love certain things or enjoy certain things or have a hobby or enjoy a sunset or a novel or a good movie or a dinner with my family or I like this? Does that mean I just can't enjoy any of the experiences that happen? No. We're talking about something that would invoke jealousy of God. If your attachment to the world will invoke a jealousy from God that you serve that as a master, that's when we're getting in trouble. But you can indeed love the Lord with all your heart and still love your family. In fact, I can give you some verses that you already know that you're obligated to love your family. So the idea is, let's not define this as some impossible ideal that we can never reach to be zero self and 100% the Lord. Because I want to lay out a case that we can do that. First, we're called to deny ourselves. Luke 9 and verse 23, Jesus says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Do you follow the Lord? Would you call yourself a disciple of the Lord? Well, yeah. Well, if anyone wants to do that, he has to deny himself. What do you mean deny yourself? Does that mean, if we define that to say, well, I don't do anything ever other than spiritual stuff. That's asinine. I mean, look at the example of Paul. Well, Paul had a job, didn't he? He was a tent maker. I mean, he also had other times. He said, for instance, in Romans chapter 15, verse 24, if memory serves me, that I want to enjoy your company for a while. Was that a social endeavor or a spiritual endeavor? Sounds social. Did they eat meals? Did they hang out? Did they laugh? Did they do various things? Yeah. I mean, was it... It's kind of like that old verse that says, pray without ceasing. Well, does that mean I can't do anything else or entertain any other thought in my head? Of course not. That's absurd. But you can indeed deny yourself and say, it's not about me, it's about the Lord. And you can orient your life in that fashion and still have a hobby. You can still watch a ball game. I watched one yesterday. Wish I hadn't, but I watched a ball game yesterday. Probably wasn't good for my blood pressure, but I watched it. But you can deny yourself, live for the Lord, and still do it. You don't have to be a monk. You don't have to resign yourself to a monastery to deny yourself. So we need to properly define these things, because we can indeed live a life that's not about me, but it's about the Lord. We can indeed live for the Lord. Let me give you a couple of examples, because these are things we're charged to do. And if we can't do them and they're just some pie-in-the-sky ideal that no one can attain, then we've got problems with our definition. Because in Romans 12 and verse 1, it says that we are present our bodies as living sacrifices. You know what the problem with a living sacrifice is? It keeps trying to crawl off the altar. I mean, think about that. If you got a living sacrifice, it doesn't want to be on that altar. It wants to just keep crawling off. So we are charged to be willing vessels for the Lord. Remember how Paul was said to be a vessel for the Lord? Well, we're told we're to be instruments of his righteousness. In other words, we are tools he uses. There's an old song we used to sing years ago. It was a camp song, so we don't sing it very often. But the song, the premise of it was, and I'll spare you the singing, you want to be used by the Lord. And it would use all these different things. I want to be used by the Lord. And it would talk about your feet and your hands and so forth and et cetera. And you may have remembered the song. I don't remember all the particulars. But the gist of it was, I want to be useful for the Lord. I want to be used by the Lord. Now, can we be living sacrifices? Can we be as instruments of righteousness? Romans chapter 6. Yeah. Can I do that and still have a job and still watch TV from time to time and still have a... Yes. The idea is not that we literally don't do any other endeavor, but the idea is that my life is whatever the Lord wants it to be, that I can be useful to him, useful to the master. Paul did. In Galatians chapter 2, he says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, what in the world does that mean? Now, Paul just said, it's not my life anymore, but I am going to let the Lord live through me. Can me and you do that? Yeah. We can do that. This isn't a how-to, but he who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord. And the Lord is basically being able to redistribute and be benevolent to other people through you. You can be an instrument of his righteousness. He can live through you. You know what's interesting about that is you might ask, well, Paul, how do I know that the Lord is living through you? In what sense and how? And again, we're not talking about metaphysically. We're talking about the idea that he is surrendering himself to do the will of his Father. In Galatians chapter 5, just akin to those verses that we looked at where it said the selfish ambition were the directive of the flesh, it then tells us the fruit of the Spirit. How do I know that Christ is living in you? Well, just look at the fruit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, meekness, gentleness, self-control, etc. You're familiar with the list. We can live for the Lord. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 19, there's this statement. What's in this section of verse 19 through 21? With my body, I will magnify the Lord. Now, what in the world's a magnifying glass? Well, what you do with a magnifying glass, don't burn ants with it. What you do with a magnifying glass is you hold it up to something and it makes that something bigger. And the idea was he was saying, I'm going to hold the magnifying glass up to my life, and what you'll see is Christ. When Christ, who is our life, appears, that's Colossians chapter 3. What's your life about? Well, my life's about making as much money as I can, having as much fun as I can, enjoying the most passions and pleasures, and going out in this hedonistic lifestyle. That's all the self and none of thee. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's what's my life about? Finding how I can use my resources, my talents, my abilities, my opportunities to serve the Lord and do something that would glorify him. that would shine the light on Him, that would magnify Him. If Paul could do it, me and you could do it. We could put God first. How in the world do we orient ourselves so that it's all of Thee and none of self? Well, we could put God first. I want to look at one example, and I hope you'll indulge me and forgive me if I'm going over a tad. Look over in Genesis chapter 22, because I want to prove to you, you can live a life that is zero of self, none of self, and all of Thee. But it doesn't require you to do that every waking moment. In fact, it wouldn't be possible. Look at Genesis chapter 22. A very familiar scene to most of us, I presume, where Abraham will offer Isaac. As we read the second verse, the instructions are given to go. Take your son and go. He will be the burnt offering. And so, verse 3, he arose and went. And then drop down to verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father?" He said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Isaac said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Now, to make a long story short, he's going to bind his son, and he is going to be the offering because that's what God told him to do. And as we drop down to verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay a hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear the Lord, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Question: was he behaving in a fashion that was none of self and all of Thee when he followed this command? You bet. And we can too. Was Abraham perfect? No. I think about the lie that he told about his wife to avoid a confrontation. I think about the episode with the maidservant of Sarah, and maybe we could argue some moral implications there. But nonetheless, he wasn't perfect. But in this particular instance, on this particular episode, when he was tested and given the opportunity, he put God first. Me and you can do that. And it would be not about me, but it's about God. It's not about what I have to sacrifice, but look what He sacrificed for me. And then we can put others second. I've often said, jokingly but seriously, the best thing that we can say as a Christian is, we're number 3. We're number 3. Now, my team was number 1 up until last night. And now they're probably going to say we're number 3 if they're lucky. But if you think about the Christian life, you put God first. You seek first the kingdom and His righteousness. He comes number 1. You love Him with all your heart, and He's in first position in your life. God will not take second position in anybody's life. He's in first position. And then you put others second, and you put yourself in third. And guess what you're doing? You're living a life that's not about me, but it's about Thee. Because that's what God charged us to do. He charged us to not be looking out only for our own interest, but for the interest of others. In fact, if we back up to verse 3 of Philippians chapter 2, he says that we're to esteem others better than ourselves. We're to be giving preference to one another. In other words, putting them above ourselves. So if we can do that in our families, in our community, and in the body, well, we can be not about self, but about God. And that's the challenge of this lesson. Not some impossible ideal, not some song that we just sing to be singing a song that sounds like a good spiritual pursuit, but actually to admonish us to strive after the charge that our life is about God and not about ourselves. And so if you've yet to surrender to the gospel call, the call that calls you out of the world and into the church, you can respond to that call now. You can confess that Christ is indeed, in your faith and understanding, the Son of God, and that He did die on the cross in your place, and that you are choosing to obey the command to be buried with Him in baptism, to have your sins remitted. And you can rise that new creation. And if you need to respond to the invitation for that or any other reason, we want to encourage you to come while together we stand and sing.